The stone stairs descended into absolute darkness, and the 18-year-old girl counted each one. Her sandals scraped against the ancient stone, the sound swallowed by earth pressing in from all sides. 23 steps. 24. The priests above continued their chanting, but their voices grew fainter with each downward step, muffled by tons of Roman soil. She carried no torch. The small oil lamp waiting below would be her only light for however long the gods granted her breath. Her white stola, the sacred garment she'd worn for 12 years, caught on the rough walls. The fabric tore. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the narrowing passage. Behind her, footsteps stopped at the entrance. The Pontifex Maximus would go no further. No one would. This descent belonged to her alone. The builders had carved these stairs for one purpose, one journey, one direction. The air grew thick, tasting of clay and centuries. Her breathing quickened, echoing off walls that pressed closer with each step. 31. 32. Somewhere above, the city of Rome continued its daily business. Merchants hawked their wares, children played in the streets, the Senate debated, and she descended. The passage opened into a small chamber, no larger than a modest sleeping quarters, a narrow bed, a pitcher of water, 3 loaves of bread, the oil lamp, its flame dancing in the airless space, everything arranged with the same precision that had governed her entire life. She was walking to her death, voluntarily, because the alternative being dragged would dishonor the goddess Vesta herself. How does a civilization transform 6-year-old girls into sacred prisoners, then bury them alive when they break? Why would Rome create a system where the purest souls faced the darkest punishments, where one stolen kiss meant suffocation in an underground tomb, where even those who survived 30 years of perfect service found themselves cast out into a world that no longer had a place for them? To understand this nightmare, we need to rewind to the day they came for the children. The ceremonial horns shattered the morning silence across Rome, and in 1,000 homes, mothers began to weep. They knew that sound. Every Roman mother with daughters between 6 and 10 knew it like they knew their own heartbeat. The selection horns, the priests of Vesta, were coming. In the wealthy district of the Palatine Hill, Claudia pressed her 7-year-old daughter into a storage room behind sacks of grain. "Stay silent, my love, no matter what you hear." The child's fingers clutched her mother's sleeve. Claudia had to pry them loose, one by one. Down in the Subura, where the poor crowded together, Livia took a kitchen knife to her daughter's beautiful hair. Handfuls of dark curls fell to the dirt floor. If the girl looked diseased, maybe they'd pass her by. Maybe. The priests moved through Rome in a slow procession. Their white robes rustled against the cobblestones. Bronze bells chimed with each step. Behind them, the lictors carried the fasces, those bundled rods that meant state authority backed by violence. They entered houses without asking. Sacred duty required no permission. In the first home, they found 3 daughters. The youngest hid behind her sisters, but the priests had done this for centuries. They knew every hiding spot. The deputy priest pointed his staff at the middle child. "That one." The mother dropped to her knees. "Please, she's sickly. She won't survive the training." The priest's voice carried no emotion. The goddess chooses whom she wills. The selected girl didn't cry. She stood frozen, like a rabbit sensing a hawk overhead. Her older sister tried to step forward, to volunteer in her place. The lictors blocked her path. But the real horror wasn't in being chosen. It was in what happened next. The moment selection touched a girl, she ceased to be her parents' daughter. She became property of the state. The priests would take her immediately. No final meal with family. No gathering of favorite possessions. No goodbye embraces that might weaken sacred resolve. The girl's mother reached for her daughter one last time. A lictor's rod cracked across her knuckles. The sound echoed off the walls. "She belongs to Vesta now," the chief priest announced. They wrapped the child in a white cloth that covered her from head to toe. Only her eyes showed through a small opening. Those eyes found her mother's face and held it, memorizing every line. They led her out into the street where a covered wagon waited. Inside, 2 other small forms sat motionless under their white shrouds. The newest girl climbed in. The door sealed shut. No windows. No way to see home one last time as the wheels began to turn. Her mother's wails followed the wagon down the street. Other mothers took up the cry, a chorus of grief that rose above the city's morning bustle. But the priest's bells rang louder, drowning out human sorrow with divine purpose. Inside the wagon, the three girls sat in darkness. One whispered her name over and over, like a prayer. Julia, my name is Julia. She was trying to hold on to it, knowing what came next. At the house of Vesta, they would strip away everything, not just clothes and possessions, but identity itself. Names became numbers during training. Novice 3, your posture is imperfect. Novice 7, you let the flame flicker. Only after taking the sacred vows would they receive new names. Vestal names, nothing connected to the families who mourned them. What happened next would haunt her mother for 30 years. The woman would see her daughter only at public ceremonies, standing with the other Vestals in their sacred box at the amphitheatre, so close she could count the freckles on her child's face. So far, she couldn't speak a single word. The girl who had once called her Mama would look through her like a stranger. Some mothers went mad from it. They'd follow the Vestal processions through the streets, calling out birth names their daughters no longer acknowledged. The urban cohorts would drag them away, but they always returned, ghosts haunting their living children. The selected girls vanished into the house of Vesta, that beautiful prison near the Forum. Behind those marble walls, the transformation began immediately. They shaved the children's heads, burned their clothes, scrubbed their skin with lye until it turned raw, washing away the contamination of the outside world. An older Vestal supervised each step. These women had undergone the same process decades ago. Their faces showed neither cruelty nor kindness, just the blank efficiency of those who'd learned to survive by forgetting they'd once been someone's daughter too. The youngest girls cried the first night. They always did. The dormitory filled with muffled sobs as 30 years of darkness stretched ahead. But crying meant punishment, not beating, not yet. First came isolation. They locked the weeping child in a stone cell with no light, no sound except her own breathing. Hours passed, sometimes days. When they finally opened the door, the child had learned her first lesson. Tears were weakness. Weakness dishonored Vesta. Dishonoring Vesta meant consequences. The name she whispered in the darkness would soon be forgotten forever. Within a month, she'd stop trying to remember it. Within a year, she'd flinch if someone accidentally called her by it. The erasure was complete, methodical, and absolute. The little girl who'd played with dolls and sung her mother's lullabies ceased to exist. In her place stood a vessel for divine flame, pure and empty and ready to burn for 3 decades. But selection was just the beginning. The real torture started with a flame that must never die. The flame flickered once, just once, and the young Vestal's blood turned to ice. Thunder rolled across the 7 hills, not the distant rumble of a passing storm, but the bone-deep crack of divine anger directly overhead. In the circular temple, 6 white-robed figures stood frozen around the sacred hearth. The flame danced sideways, fought the sudden downdraft, recovered, then flickered again. Licinia's breath caught in her throat. 22 years old, 4 years into her service, and she'd drawn the midnight watch, the worst watch, when exhaustion made your eyes heavy, and the hypercourse system created strange drafts, and every shadow might hide a priest, checking whether you'd dozed off. The storm struck with the force of a siege engine. Rain hammered the bronze roof like 1,000 fists. Wind shrieked through the columns. The sacred flame bent horizontal, its light painting wild shadows on the walls. Licinia dropped to her knees beside the hearth, her hands cupped around the flame like she was protecting a newborn bird. "Please," she whispered to Vesta. "Please." Lightning split the sky. The flash illuminated the temple's interior for one terrible instant, long enough to see the flame gutter down to a blue wisp, long enough to see her death written in that dying light. The storm approaching Rome would seal her fate. She knew the law. Every Vestal knew it carved into their bones. If the flame died on your watch, you died too. Not immediately. First came the trial, the interrogation. The Pontifex Maximus would convene the College of Priests. They'd examine every moment leading to the flame's death. What you ate, whether you'd touched anything unclean, whether you'd harbored impure thoughts. But everyone knew the verdict before the trial began. The flame only died when its guardian had sinned. Licinia's hands shook as she fed dried herbs into the hearth. The flame caught them, flared higher. Safe for another heartbeat. The wind howled through the smoke hole above, trying to tear the fire from its bronze bowl. She grabbed the sacred bellows, pumped air into the coals. Too much, and she'd blow it out. Too little, and it would starve. Footsteps on marble. Soft, deliberate, cutting through the storm's fury. Licinia didn't turn. She knew that tread. Claudia Quinta, the Vestalis Maxima, eldest of their order. 30 years of perfect service, 10 as their leader. The woman who'd overseen Licinia's training, who'd held her head underwater during the purification rituals until her lungs screamed, who'd taught her that suffering was just another form of prayer. The flame struggles, Claudia stated. Not a question. Never questions with her. The Storm Mother, it's stronger than... The flame doesn't care about excuses. Claudia knelt beside her. Together they shielded the fire with their bodies. The wind found every gap, tested every weakness. Licinia felt the older woman's absolute stillness, like she'd become part of the temple itself. No trembling, no fear, just iron will focused on that single dancing point of light. "Tell me," Claudia said softly, "what you were thinking when the flame first faltered." The question sliced deeper than any blade, because Licinia had been thinking of something, someone. Marcus, the young senator who'd smiled at her during the last public ceremony. Just a smile. Nothing more. But she'd carried it with her back to the temple, turned it over in her mind during the long watches. I was focused on my duty, Mother. Lies are a form of impurity. The flame dipped low. Licinia's heart hammered against her ribs. Claudia reached into the folds of her stola and withdrew a small vial. The oil inside glowed amber in the firelight. Sacred oil, blessed by generations of Vestals, reserved for the most desperate moments. "This will burn for hours," Claudia said. "Even in this wind." She unstoppered the vial. The scent hit Licinia like a physical force. Myrrh and frankincense and something else, something that made her eyes water. Claudia poured 3 drops onto the coals. The flame roared back to life, steady and strong. "But it comes with a price." Claudia's voice dropped to barely above the wind. "Tomorrow, you report to the Pontifex Maximus. You confess your wandering thoughts. You submit to purification." Licinia's stomach clenched. Purification meant the verberatio, the ritual beating in the dark chamber beneath the temple, where no light entered and no sound escaped. "I've had no impure thoughts, Mother." "Then the rods will find nothing to drive out." What the Pontifex Maximus kept hidden in that locked chamber below the temple, every Vestal learned eventually. But knowledge came through experience, not words. The older Vestals never spoke of their purifications. They emerged from below with perfect posture and empty eyes and returned to their duties as if nothing had happened. But sometimes, on cold mornings, Licinia saw them move stiffly, saw them flinch when someone raised a hand too quickly. The storm raged for 3 more hours. Licinia and Claudia knelt beside the flame, feeding it, shielding it, breathing their prayers into its heart. When dawn finally broke, pale and watery through the rain clouds, the sacred fire still burned. Claudia rose, her knees cracking after hours on cold stone. She looked down at Licinia with something that might have been pity, if Vestals were allowed such emotions. "The Pontifex will see you at the 3rd hour." She swept from the temple, leaving Licinia alone with the flame and her terror, because she knew what came next. They all knew. The accusation, the trial, the careful ritual that maintained the fiction of justice while ensuring the predetermined outcome. But first came the softening. They wouldn't feed her. Water only, for 3 days. By the time she faced the priests, hunger would make her weak, confused, easy to guide toward the correct confession. Because someone had to take responsibility when the sacred flame faltered. The storm was irrelevant. Divine will was irrelevant. Only human failure mattered, and human failure demanded human punishment. Licinia stared into the flame she'd saved. In its depths, she saw her future. The dark chamber, the patient priests, with their questions. The moment when exhaustion and hunger and fear finally broke her, when she'd admit to thoughts she'd never had just to make it end. The younger Vestals found her still kneeling there when they came for morning prayers. They saw her hollow eyes, the way her hands trembled. They understood. Next time, the storm might come for them. "Sister," the youngest whispered, barely 13, still new enough to show compassion. "Should we bring you bread?" "No food," Licinia answered. Her voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. "The purification has already begun." The girl's face went white. She backed away, nearly stumbling over her own feet. The others filed past Licinia like she'd already ceased to exist. Maybe she had. The moment that flame flickered, she'd crossed from person to property, from guardian to sacrifice. The Pontifex would be sharpening his questions. The chamber below would be prepared. And somewhere in the darkness, the rods waited. 3 days later, they took her down. The passage descended through layers of Rome, through the foundations of the temple, through the bones of older temples built by kings, through soil that remembered when wolves ruled these hills. The air grew thick, tasting of centuries. No torches. Darkness was part of the ritual. Licinia felt her way along walls worn smooth by countless hands. Behind her, 2 priests followed. Their breathing echoed in the narrow space. They didn't speak. Speaking would acknowledge her humanity. The passage opened into nothingness. Her foot found empty air where floor should be. She caught herself against the wall, heart racing. A test. Everything was a test. "Proceed," one priest commanded. She dropped to her knees, felt along the edge. Stone steps, worn into grooves. She descended backward, like climbing down a ladder in absolute darkness. 20 steps, 30. The priests remained above. This descent belonged to the accused alone. The chamber at the bottom smelled of fear sweat and old blood. Her bare feet found smooth stone, polished by who knew how many trembling Vestals. The space felt both vast and crushingly small. The darkness pressed against her eyes like physical weight. Licinia of the Quincti. The Pontifex Maximus spoke from somewhere in the black. His voice came from every direction at once. "You stand accused of impurity that weakened the sacred flame." "I maintained my vows," she whispered. Something whistled through the air. Pain exploded across her shoulders. She bit through her lip to keep from crying out. "You will speak only to answer questions." A different voice. "How many waited in the darkness? On the night of the storm, where were your thoughts?" "On my duty." The rod struck again. Lower back this time. Precise. Calculated. Whoever wielded it had practiced for decades. "Your thoughts," the voice insisted. On maintaining the flame. Another strike. Her knees buckled. The stone floor rushed up to meet her. She caught herself on her palms, felt wetness there. Her own blood or centuries of others. No way to know in the darkness. The screams never left the temple, and now she understood why. The chamber's construction swallowed sound like a hungry throat. She could shriek until her voice gave out, and the Vestals above would hear nothing. The merchants in the forum would continue their trade. The Senate would debate, and she would break in perfect silence. "Stand," the Pontifex commanded. She tried. Her legs shook. Halfway up, the rod caught her behind the knees. She crashed down, chin striking stone, tasted copper. I said stand. She stood, swaying, blind but upright. "The flame flickered because you allowed impurity into your heart. Confess." I thought of nothing improper." The beating began in earnest then, not wild or angry, methodical, scientific. They had mapped every nerve, every point of maximum pain for minimum damage. The rods fell in rhythm, like drummers keeping time. Between strikes, questions. Always the same questions. What impurity? Confess. The flame knows. Confess. Time dissolved in the darkness. She might have been there hours or days. No way to track the sun's passage in that buried place. Only pain and questions, and the growing certainty that confession was the only escape. But confession meant death, living burial, the slow suffocation in another dark chamber. So Licinia held her silence through the first session. They dragged her back to a small cell, still underground, still dark, water only. She lapped it from a bowl like an animal, unable to see even that in dignity. 3 days later, they brought her back. The rods had evolved over centuries. Wood wrapped in leather, soaked in salt water to prevent infection, weighted with lead for deep bone bruises that would ache for months. Some thick as a man's wrist for broad, stunning blows, others thin as reeds for the tender places, the ones that made you forget your own name. By the 5th session, Licinia confessed to thoughts of Marcus. By the 7th, she invented impurities she'd never imagined. By the 10th, she begged them to let her die. "Death is not yours to request," the Pontifex informed her. "You live or die by Vesta's will, expressed through us." They brought other tools then. Not to extract more confessions, she'd given them everything. These were for purification, to drive out the admitted corruption through measured doses of agony. The instruments of her punishment had been perfected over centuries to leave no trace. The blindfold wasn't for her protection. It was so the Pontifex Maximus wouldn't have to see her face while he destroyed her body. They wrapped the cloth tight around Licinia's eyes in the upper chamber. 3 layers of fine linen, pressed until even the brightest torch became nothing. Her world shrank to sound and touch, and the copper taste of fear flooding her mouth. "The goddess requires darkness," the Pontifex murmured. His voice carried that particular softness reserved for sacred cruelty. "In darkness, impurity cannot hide." 2 priests gripped her arms. Their fingers found pressure points with practiced ease, guiding her toward the passage she'd already descended once. This time, blindfolded, each step became an act of faith. Faith that the next footfall would find stone. Faith that they wouldn't simply push her into the void. The temperature dropped with each downward step. The walls pressed closer. She heard her own breathing, ragged and quick, bouncing back from stone worn smooth by centuries of trembling hands. Then, the chamber. The space opened around her like a mouth. She felt it in the way sound changed, how her footsteps no longer echoed sharp but spread into whispers. The priests released her arms. Sandaled feet shuffled away. A door ground shut. Bronze against stone. That specific scrape that meant no escape. Silence. Not peaceful silence. The aggressive quiet of a place built to swallow screams. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She turned slowly, arms extended, trying to map this burial of a room. Her fingers found only air. "Kneel." The command came from everywhere and nowhere. She dropped to her knees so fast bone cracked against stone. The pain shot white stars across her blindfolded vision. Something whistled through the darkness. The rod caught her across the shoulder blades. Not a wild strike, but measured, precise. It drove the air from her lungs in a soundless gasp. Before she could draw breath, another whistle. Lower back this time. The blow pitched her forward, onto her palms. "You have confessed to impure thoughts." A different voice. Younger. One of the assistant priests, earning his place through her pain. "Now we drive them out." The rods came from every direction. She couldn't predict them, couldn't brace. That was the point. In the darkness, surrounded by invisible instruments wielded by faceless men, her body became a map of surprise agonies. They'd soaked the rods in salt water. She smelled it as they cut through air, tasted it when one caught her across the mouth. The leather wrapping had been scored with careful grooves. Each strike left its signature, parallel welts that would rise and burn for days. But the physical pain was just the foundation. "Tell us about Marcus." The Pontifex again, conversational as discussing weather. His smile. Describe it. She tried to speak. The words came out slurred through split lips. It was nothing. Just a moment of... The rod interrupted her. Temple this time. The world exploded into spinning lights behind her blindfold. She felt herself falling sideways. Couldn't tell which way was down until stone rushed up to meet her. Describe. His smile. They had all the time in the world. She had only darkness and the certainty that this would continue until she gave them what they wanted. So she described it. The way one corner of his mouth lifted higher. How his eyes crinkled. The single dimple that appeared on his left cheek. With each detail, she felt something inside her die. "Good," the Pontifex approved. "Now we burn it out." The beating resumed with mechanical precision. They worked in shifts, she realized. Fresh arms when the first grew tired. The rods fell in patterns, 3 to the back, 2 to the thighs, 1 across the soles of her feet that made her scream into the darkness. Except the scream made no sound. They'd designed this chamber to eat voices. She could shriek until her throat tore, and the stone would swallow every note. Above, the other Vestals continued their duties unaware. The sacred flame burned steady, tended by pure hands, while impure ones were beaten clean below. Time ceased to exist in that darkness. She might have been there hours or days. The only measurement was pain, and pain had no clock. Sometimes they paused, gave her water from a clay cup pressed to her lips. Let her catch her breath just long enough to appreciate the next wave of agony. The impurity runs deep, someone observed. Clinical, detached. See how she still flinches? The corruption fights to remain. More whistling. More impacts. They found places she didn't know could hurt. The soft spot behind her knees. The tender arch of her foot. The points where neck met shoulder. Each strike calculated for maximum effect with minimum permanent damage. They were artists of agony, and she was their canvas. But worse than the rods was the thing they made her swallow. "Open your mouth." The Pontifex's voice, closer now. She smelled incense on his robes, sacred oils that seemed obscene in this buried hell. She clenched her jaw shut. A rod cracked across her knuckles. Her mouth opened involuntarily in a gasp of pain. Something pressed between her teeth. Cloth, thick, musty, tasting of fear sweat from whoever wore it last. "This is mercy," he explained, as unseen hands tied the gag tight. "So you don't bite through your tongue during purification. We're not monsters, child." The gag served 2 purposes, she realized as the beating resumed. Yes, it kept her from damaging herself, but it also transformed her screams into muffled whimpers, animal sounds. The noises of something less than human, which was exactly what she'd become in this darkness. Not a woman, not a priestess, just meat being tenderized back into holiness. They worked her over with scientific thoroughness. When her back grew too damaged, they focused on her legs. When she could no longer stand, they propped her up and concentrated on her arms. Always careful, always precise. Never quite enough to cause permanent harm. Just endless, measured doses of agony. Between sessions, they asked questions. "Do you still see his smile?" At first, she did. Marcus's face floated in the darkness behind her blindfold, the only light in that buried world. But each blow drove him further away. Each impact scattered the memory like smoke. By the 10th session, or perhaps the 20th, she couldn't remember what he looked like at all. "The purification takes hold," someone noted with satisfaction. They were right. The beating had scoured her clean, not just of impure thoughts, but of all thought. In the darkness, under the patient tutelage of consecrated rods, she'd been reduced to her component parts, meat and bone and the desperate desire for it to end. "One final test," the Pontifex announced. The gag came out. She worked her jaw, tasted blood where she'd bitten her cheeks despite their precaution. Someone placed a cup to her lips. Water. Sweet, clean water that might have been nectar. "Tell us of Marcus now." She searched the empty corridors of her mind, found nothing. Not his face, not his name. Just a vague sense that once something had existed there. Something the rods had driven out. I don't." Her voice came out broken, barely human. "There's nothing. He's gone." The goddess be praised. Real warmth in the Pontifex's voice now. The satisfaction of a craftsman admiring his work. "You are purified, child, cleansed, made worthy once more to tend the sacred flame." The blindfold came off. But the darkness remained. Her eyes, so long covered, couldn't process even the faint light filtering down the passage. She blinked, tears streaming, seeing nothing but shadows on shadows. They had to carry her out. Her legs wouldn't support her weight. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through the map of bruises they'd painted on her flesh. But she was pure now. The rods had made certain of that. Back in the temple, they laid her on a simple cot. The physician, a woman sworn to silence about what she treated, worked with gentle efficiency. Salves for the worst of the welts. Bandages where skin had split. Poppy wine for the pain, though not enough to fully dull it. Suffering was part of the purification. To escape it too quickly would undo their holy work. The other Vestals visited in shifts. They brought water, changed her bandages, said nothing about the marks covering her body like purple scripture. They'd all been through their own purifications. They understood that some experiences lived beyond words. On the third day she could stand. On the fifth she could walk without limping. By the seventh she returned to her duties at the flame. The fire burned steady under her watch. It would never flicker again. The memory of the rods assured that. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she'd catch herself trying to remember what had been beaten out of her. A face, a name, something that had once seemed worth dying for but now existed only as an absence, a hollow place where the rods had done their work. The younger Vestals watched her move stiffly through the temple, saw how she flinched when someone raised a hand too quickly, how she never quite met anyone's eyes. They understood the lesson her body taught. The flame was everything, the flame was all, and anything that challenged that truth would be beaten into darkness until only the flame remained. Marcus passed her in the forum 2 weeks later. She looked through him like he was made of air. Whatever part of her had known his name lay buried in that chamber beneath the temple, beaten into silence by patient hands and consecrated rods. The purification was complete, but some transgressions demanded more than broken bodies. They required complete erasure. The senator's wife smiled as she whispered the accusation that would bury her rival alive. Her breath carried the scent of cinnamon and calculation as she leaned close to her husband's ear. Around them, the feast continued. Silver spoons scraped against gold plates. Wine splashed into jeweled cups. The conversations of Rome's elite rose and fell like waves against marble shores. The Vestal Cornelia. Her words slipped between the sounds of privilege. I saw her in the garden, with your brother. The senator's hand stilled on his cup, just for a heartbeat, long enough for his wife to know the seed had taken root. He didn't ask which garden, didn't ask when. Those details would come later, shaped and sculpted like clay on a potter's wheel. You're certain? His voice stayed level. They'd played this game before. As certain as sunrise. She selected an olive from the platter, bit through its flesh with perfect white teeth. Though, of course, I could be mistaken. The moonlight plays tricks. But there were no mistakes in accusations against Vestals. Only opportunities. 3 tables away, Cornelia sat with her sisters in white. 22 years old. 8 years into her service. Beautiful in that austere way that made senators' wives grind their teeth. She laughed at something the youngest Vestal whispered. The sound rang pure as temple bells. The senator's wife watched that laugh, counted the beats of her rival's happiness. Tomorrow, she'd count screams instead. The machinery of destruction began with such elegant simplicity. A word to a husband to his clients, clients to the street corners where whispers bred like flies on meat. By dawn, half of Rome would know. By noon, the Pontifex Maximus would have no choice but to investigate. The law demanded it. Any accusation against a Vestal, no matter how absurd, triggered the formal process. The College of Priests would convene. The questions would begin. And once those particular wheels started turning, they ground forward until they found flesh to crush. I'll speak to Marcus tomorrow, the senator murmured. Privately, Marcus, the brother. Young, ambitious, with the kind of face that made married women forget their vows. Whether he'd actually met Cornelia in any garden mattered less than whether he could be persuaded to remember it. The evidence they produced would make your skin crawl. A love poem, allegedly, in Cornelia's hand. Never mind that Vestals learned to write in a specific script, formal and recognizable. A talented forger could approximate it. The differences would be subtle, the kind only an expert might notice, and experts could be bought or threatened into silence. A strand of hair, long and dark, supposedly found in Marcus's chamber, as if 1,000 Roman women didn't share that colouring, as if hair couldn't be plucked from a brush, a comb, the floor of any public bath, a witness who'd seen 2 figures in the garden. Darkness obscured faces, of course, but one wore white. Who else dressed all in white but a Vestal? The logic was circular, perfect. unbreakable as bronze. They even produced a bronze hairpin, delicate work, the kind Vestals wore, found beneath the very bench where the alleged meeting occurred. The senator's wife had purchased it herself from a metalworker in the Subura, paid him triple to forget her face. Each piece meant nothing alone. Together, they painted a picture of secret meetings, forbidden touches, sacred vows shattered for base desire. The kind of story Romans loved to believe about those who claimed to be pure. The formal accusation came at dawn on the third day. 12 lictors marched through the forum. Their boots struck the stones in perfect unison. Thud, 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 like a giant's heartbeat. The crowd parted before them, mothers pulling children close, merchants abandoning their stalls to follow the spectacle. They surrounded the house of Vesta before the morning prayers. The Vestals emerged in a line, faces covered by their veils, but everyone knew which one they'd come for. The lictors moved with the certainty of men following a script written days before. Cornelia of the Cornelii, the senior lictor's voice echoed off the temple walls. You stand accused of breaking your sacred vows. She didn't run. Where would she go? The veils couldn't hide how her shoulders stiffened, how her hands clenched in the folds of her stola. But she walked forward with her chin high. Dignity was all she had left. They bound her wrists with rope, not chains. The fiction of respect must be maintained. A Vestal was sacred until proven otherwise, but the rope bit just as deep, left the same red marks that would still show at her trial. Her sisters watched from the temple steps. Their faces stayed hidden, but their breathing gave them away. Quick, shallow, the sound of women who knew they watched their own future. Today Cornelia, tomorrow any of them. The crowd followed the procession through the streets. At first, they stayed quiet. Awe, or fear, or simple uncertainty kept their tongues still. But as they moved deeper into the city, toward the house where she'd be held until trial, the first voice rose. Whore. Just one word. But it broke the dam. More voices joined. Accusations, curses, the kind of rage that only comes when the pure are revealed as human. Someone threw a rotten apple. It splattered against Cornelia's white stola, left a brown stain like old blood. The lictors didn't stop it. Their job was to deliver her alive. Nothing more. By the time they reached the holding house, her pristine robes were ruined. Fruit pulp, wine, mud. The crowd's hatred painted across the sacred white. She looked like what they'd already decided she was. Fallen, corrupt, worthy only of the pit. Inside the house, they gave her water, bread, a clean stola to replace the ruined one. The matron who guarded her was forbidden to speak. Conversation might taint the proceedings. But her eyes held something worse than contempt. Pity. Cornelia spent 3 days in that bare room. No visitors, no news, just the sounds of Rome beyond the walls, and the knowledge that somewhere the priests were gathering their evidence, shaping the case, preparing the questions that would damn her regardless of her answers. The trial began before it began. On the first day they brought the poem. She'd never seen it before. The hand looked like hers, close enough to make her doubt her own memory. Had she written something in a moment of weakness? Some scrap of thought that betrayed the stirrings they all felt but never acknowledged? I didn't write this. Her voice came out steady. Years of ritual chanting had taught her control. The prosecutor, a thin priest with eyes like chips of obsidian, smiled. Then you won't mind copying it, to prove the hand differs. They gave her parchment, ink, the same reed pen she used for temple records. She copied each word with mechanical precision, but her hand shook, just slightly. Fear made her letters waver. See how similar? The prosecutor held both documents to the light. The same slant, the same flourishes. Ah, because you gave me the same tools, made me copy the same words. Are you suggesting we fabricated evidence? His voice carried perfect shock, as if the very idea offended the gods themselves. She knew better than to answer. Yes meant accusing the priesthood. No meant accepting the forgery. Silence meant guilt. Every choice led to the same destination. Her own sisters were forced to testify. They brought them in one at a time, youngest to oldest, each wearing the full ceremonial robes, as if sanctity could wash clean what they were about to do. "Did Cornelia ever speak of men?" the prosecutor asked the youngest, barely 14, still new enough to flinch at lies. "Never." The girl's voice barely carried across the chamber. "Never? In all your years together? Not once did she mention finding someone attractive? Not even in passing?" The girl's eyes darted to Cornelia, pleading. They'd all talked, late at night, when the sacred flame burned low and loneliness pressed heavy. Harmless whispers about which senator had kind eyes, which priest spoke gently. Nothing actionable, just the human need to feel something, anything, in their marble cage. Sometimes, the girl swallowed, sometimes we all spoke about things. What things? Just observations about people, nothing improper. But Cornelia participated in these conversations? A pause that stretched like a bowstring. "Yes. Thank you, sister." One by one, they drew out admissions, not of wrongdoing but of humanity. Cornelia had once commented on a gladiator's strength. She'd smiled when a young priest complimented her voice during chanting. She'd been seen adjusting her hair before a public ceremony, clearly trying to look attractive. Each small truth twisted into evidence of corruption. The prosecutors built their case from the dust of ordinary moments, spun into gold thread that would strangle her. But the worst betrayal came from Marcus himself. They brought him in chains, though everyone knew they were just for show. His face carried the hollow look of a man who'd made a deal with necessity. Whatever they'd promised or threatened, it had been enough. "Tell us about the garden," the prosecutor prompted. Marcus spoke to the floor. "It was late, after the summer feast. I was walking, clearing my head from wine, and I saw her, Cornelia, by the fountain." "You're certain it was her?" "The white stola, the way she stood." "Yes. Did you speak?" "Here." Marcus paused. The chamber held its breath. Even the scribe's pen stilled. This was the moment that would tip judgment from correction to death. She spoke first. The words fell like stones into still water. She said she'd been watching me. Gasps from the gathered priests. Cornelia's hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. The lie was so perfectly crafted, just scandalous enough to damn her, not so extreme as to strain belief. "What did you do?" I was weak. She was beautiful. The moonlight, the wine. I forgot myself." "You touched her?" "Just her hand, once, before I remembered who she was, what she was. I ran, left her there." "And you said nothing? Reported nothing?" "I was ashamed and afraid. Who would believe a Vestal had pursued me?" But they believed now. The story confirmed every prejudice, every whispered suspicion about what women did when locked away from the world. Of course she'd pursued him. Of course she'd broken first. Women were weak, even Vestals, especially Vestals, with all that purity bottled up until it fermented into poison. The verdict was announced before the trial began. They went through the motions for 3 more days. More witnesses, more evidence. Each piece sliding perfectly into place like a mosaic depicting her guilt. But everyone knew, had known from the moment the senator's wife smiled over her wine cup. The Pontifex Maximus stood to deliver judgment. His voice filled the chamber with divine authority. "Cornelia of the Cornelii, this sacred court finds you guilty of breaking your vows, of corrupting the purity that keeps Rome strong, of betraying the goddess who gave you privilege and position." She didn't cry, didn't beg. What use were tears against a tide that had been rising since before her arrest? "However," he continued, and here his voice took on false kindness, "because you have served faithfully for 8 years, because your corruption seems limited to thought and brief touch, because you show acceptance of guilt through your silence, we offer mercy." Mercy. The word tasted like ash. "You will not face the pit. Instead, you will be purified through the rods, cleansed of corruption, allowed to complete your service if you survive the purification intact." The relief in the chamber was palpable. Not death, just darkness and measured agony until she forgot whatever made her human enough to want a kind touch. The senator's wife would be disappointed. She'd crafted such a perfect trap, only to catch a beating instead of a burial. But the pontifex wasn't finished. "Unless," he said, and the word hung in the air like a blade, "you wish to confess to greater sins, to unburden yourself completely. The goddess rewards honesty, even at the end. The trap within the trap. Confess to the lesser crime, accept the rods, and perhaps survive broken but breathing. Or stay silent and leave doubt. Let them wonder if more corruption hid beneath." Cornelia stood, squared her shoulders, met the pontifex's eyes with the last of her dignity. "I have nothing to confess, because I am innocent. The garden meeting never happened. The poem isn't mine. Marcus lies to save himself from whatever you threatened. But I'll take your rods, your darkness, your mercy." She smiled then, cold as winter moonlight. "Because I know the truth, and the goddess knows. And someday Rome will know what you did here." The silence stretched until it sang. "So be it." The pontifex's voice carried no emotion. "Prepare the chamber. The purification begins at sunset." They took her away, back to the holding house. 6 hours to prepare, to eat, to pray, to ready herself for the darkness below. But as the lictors led her out, she passed the senator's wife in the corridor. Just for a moment, just long enough to see the smile hadn't left those perfect lips. "A pity," the woman murmured. "The pit would have been cleaner." Cornelia said nothing, but she remembered that face, that voice, that smile. She'd carry them into the darkness, use them as anchors when the rods fell, because survival was its own revenge. And she would survive, if only to watch that smile falter when she emerged, purified and unbroken, to finish her service. The punishment chamber had been prepared 3 days before her arrest. The preparations were already complete, the rods soaked and ready, the chamber aired and swept, the priests selected and briefed, all of it arranged while Cornelia still laughed with her sisters at dinner, innocent of the machinery grinding toward her destruction. That was the truth the senator's wife knew. The verdict existed before the crime. The punishment preceded the trial. Rome's justice was theatre, and everyone knew their roles. Except Cornelia. She'd believed in the process, in truth's power to overcome lies. Now, as shadows lengthened toward sunset, she sat in her cell learning otherwise. Outside, she heard them, the priests descending to make final preparations, the whisper of leather against stone as they tested the rods. Soon, they'd come for her, take her down into darkness where her humanity would be beaten out strike by strike. She'd emerge pure, empty, exactly what they'd wanted all along, unless she didn't emerge at all. Sometimes the rods went too far. Sometimes bodies broke beyond repair. Sometimes Vestals crawled out of that darkness only to die days later from injuries no one could see. Internal bleeding, damaged organs, the kind of hurt that hid inside until it was too late. Maybe that was what the senator's wife truly wanted. Not the quick death of the pit, but the slow agony of a body betraying itself, dying by degrees in a temple bed, while her sisters watched and understood the price of being envied. The door opened. 3 priests waited. It's time. Cornelia stood, smoothed her stola one last time, fixed her eyes on the middle distance where nothing could touch her. I'm ready. But no one was ever ready for what waited in the darkness below, the chamber that had been prepared before her guilt, the patient priests with their practiced hands, the rods that would fall like rain until she forgot her own name. She descended the stairs, each step bringing her closer to a justice written before she was born. And somewhere above, the senator's wife selected another olive, bit through its flesh, and smiled. They dressed her in wedding clothes, and the crowd pressed closer to see the bride who would marry death itself. White silk draped across Licinia's shoulders, finer than anything she'd worn as a Vestal. The fabric whispered against her skin with each movement. They'd bathed her in rose water until the scent clung to every strand of hair, painted her lips the deep red of pomegranate seeds, fastened gold pins shaped like butterflies in the elaborate braids coiled around her head. The matrons who prepared her worked in silence. Their hands moved with ritual precision, just as they'd dressed 100 brides before, but their eyes stayed fixed on their task, never meeting hers. The woman painting kohl around Licinia's eyes let the brush tremble only once. Outside the preparation chamber, Drums began their funeral beat. Slow, measured, one strike every 3 heartbeats. The sound rolled through the forum like thunder moving underground. "Hold still," the eldest matron murmured. She fastened the flame-colored veil across Licinia's face. Through the translucent fabric, the world turned the color of sunset, of blood, of the fire she'd failed to protect. They brought the wedding crown last. Not flowers for this bride. They'd woven it from wheat stalks, the symbol of Ceres and the harvest. Life and death twisted together in golden loops. The stalks crackled as they settled the crown on her head. The sound made her flinch. "Don't," the matron whispered. Just that single word. But Licinia heard everything underneath. "Don't flinch. Don't cry. Don't make this harder than it already island." The door opened. 6 lictors waited in the corridor, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks. Bronze faces frozen in expressions of divine judgment. Through the eye holes, human eyes blinked. One of them had been crying. The tear tracks showed on the bronze. They surrounded her in formation, 3 ahead, 3 behind, close enough that she felt their breath through the masks, close enough that running was impossible, even if her legs would carry her. The drums struck faster now, still funeral slow but building. Each beat echoed off marble walls, off statues of gods who watched with stone eyes, off the hearts of citizens already gathering to watch her final procession. The calculation behind her death would make a mathematician weep. They emerged from the preparation chamber into blinding daylight. The forum spread before them, packed with bodies. Every merchant had closed shop. Every senator had left his debates. Every mother had brought her children to see what happened to women who broke sacred laws. But first came the reading of provisions. The Pontifex Maximus stood on the rostrum, unrolling the ancient scroll. His voice carried across the silent crowd. "Let it be known that mercy attends even the condemned. The Vestal Licinia shall be provided as befits one who served the goddess, however imperfectly." He began the list, each item chosen with mathematical precision. Not random kindness, but careful cruelty disguised as compassion. 3 loaves of bread. He paused between each item, letting the crowd absorb the meaning. 1 pitcher of water. 1 lamp with oil sufficient for 1 day's burning. 1 pallet of straw for comfort. Licinia stood perfectly still, the wedding crown heavy on her head. She knew the calculations. Everyone who'd served in the temple knew. 3 loaves meant 7 days of starvation rations. 1 pitcher meant 4 days before death by thirst. 1 day's oil meant 20 hours of light before eternal darkness. They wanted her to choose: starve slowly over a week, die of thirst in half that time, or eat and drink normally and spend her final days in absolute blackness, waiting for the air to run out. "These provisions honor her years of service," the Pontifex continued. He managed to sound magnanimous. A common criminal would receive nothing, but Vesta remembers her servants, even in judgment. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman sobbed. Quick, choked off. Licinia didn't turn to look. It might be someone who knew her, might be a stranger, moved by the theatre of it all. Either way, tears changed nothing. The procession began to move. The drummers led, their funeral beat, now joined by bronze bells. Not the bright chimes of celebration, but the hollow tolling reserved for the dead. Behind them, priests carried the provisions on a silver platter, displaying them like wedding gifts. The crowd parted as they passed. Some reached out, trying to touch her veil for luck or curse. The lictors knocked their hands away with ceremonial rods, but they couldn't stop the whispers. "So young. Should have stayed pure. My daughter's age. Death's too good for her." The worst part wasn't the burial. It was what happened in the darkness below. They processed through the forum, past the temple where she'd served. The sacred flame flickered visibly through the entrance. Her replacement, a girl of 16, stood feeding it with steady hands. Their eyes met for 1 heartbeat through the veil. The girl's face went white. She turned back to the flame. Down the sacred way they walked, past the homes of senators who'd condemned her, past the shops where she'd never again buy offerings for the goddess, past the fountains where common women drew water, free women who could love and marry and die in bed surrounded by grandchildren. The wedding veil caught every sob from the crowd, every curse. The fabric grew heavy with the moisture of other people's emotions. Licinia breathed through it, tasting rose water and salt and the copper tang of her own fear. The entrance to the Campus Celeratus appeared ahead. The evil field. The cursed ground where they buried Vestals alive. Just inside the city walls but outside the sacred boundary. Not quite in Rome. Not quite beyond it. A liminal space for those who'd become liminal themselves. The crowd's energy shifted. The festival atmosphere of righteous judgment darkened into something else. Reality. They were about to watch a woman walk willingly to her death. The drums beat faster. The bells tolled louder. But underneath, Licinia heard individual breathing. Quick. Shallow. The sound of people realizing what they'd come to see. Workers had already prepared the chamber. She saw the dark opening, a perfect square cut into the earth, steps leading down into blackness. They'd lined the edges with white stones, like a well, like a throat waiting to swallow. The lictors stopped 10 feet from the entrance. This last walk she made alone. The law was specific. No one could force a Vestal underground. She had to take each step herself, prove her acceptance of divine justice, show Rome that even the condemned honored the goddess. The Pontifex spoke one last time. Licinia of the Vestals, you have been judged impure. Do you accept the mercy of provisions and the justice of earth? The formula required a response. She lifted her chin, spoke through the veil. I accept what the goddess wills. Then go to your marriage bed. May the earth receive you gently. She walked forward, each step measured, controlled. The wedding dress dragged in the dust. The crown of wheat stalks caught sunlight, turned it to gold. At the edge she paused, not from fear, from calculation. The stairs were narrow. The dress would tangle if she wasn't careful. She gathered the fabric in both hands, lifting it like any bride approaching her threshold. The crowd made a sound. Not quite gasp, not quite moan. The noise of recognition. She began to descend, but first, they made her watch them seal her tomb from above. The first step down felt like stepping off the edge of the world. The second brought the walls closer. By the third, she couldn't see the crowd anymore. Only the square of sky above, bright and blue and impossibly far. The stairs continued down. 7, 8, 9. The drums faded. The bells grew distant, but she heard new sounds. Her own breathing, loud in the narrow passage. The whisper of silk against stone walls. The crack of wheat stalks breaking in her crown. At the 15th step, the passage opened into the chamber proper. The promised provisions sat on a small table. 3 loaves, 1 pitcher, 1 lamp, already lit, its flame dancing. 1 pallet of straw in the corner. Everything arranged with the same care as a wedding chamber. She stood in the center of the space, looking up at that square of sky, waiting. They wouldn't start until they were sure she'd reached the bottom, sure she wouldn't try to climb back out. The law required her cooperation until the end. Shadows moved across the opening. The workers had arrived with their tools, their stones, their mortar. She heard them talking in low voices, discussing the technical aspects. How many stones for the first layer? How thick the mortar should be? Just another job on a summer day. The first stone slid into place with a grinding sound that shook dust from the ceiling. It covered 1 corner of the opening. 3 corners of sky remained. For now, a second stone, a third. The workers found their rhythm. The sky shrank with each placement, from square to triangle, triangle to sliver, sliver to crack. The sounds grew muffled as the barrier thickened, stone against stone, trowels spreading mortar, boots shuffling on earth above. With each stone, the chamber grew darker. The single lamp flame seemed smaller, more fragile. The air already tasted different, heavier, earth-flavored, like breathing soil. The last visible crack of sky looked like a star, 1 bright point in growing darkness. Then that too vanished. A final grinding, a final scrape, then silence so complete she heard her own heartbeat. They'd continue building above, layer after layer, making certain, but she couldn't hear them anymore. The earth swallowed sound as efficiently as it would swallow her. Licinia stood in the lamplight, still wearing her wedding dress, still crowned with wheat. The calculations began automatically. 3 loaves, 7 days if she rationed. 1 pitcher, 4 days no matter how she stretched it. 20 hours of light. Then darkness. She could scream now. No one would hear. Could rage, weep, bargain with gods who'd already turned away. Could spend her final days however she chose. The last freedom they allowed. But the worst part wasn't the burial. It was what happened in the darkness below. The lamp oil would last 6 days, the air only 4, and she knew exactly which death would claim her first. Licinia sat on the stone floor, wedding dress pooling around her like spilled milk. The lamp flame threw her shadow against the walls, a dark giant that swayed with each flicker. She'd already done the mathematics. The chamber measured 8 feet by 8 feet, 7 feet high, 448 cubic feet of air. A person at rest consumed 15 cubic feet per hour, 29 hours, maybe 30 if she stayed perfectly still. Above her head, tons of earth pressed down. She heard it settling, little clicks and groans as the weight found its balance, dirt sifting through gaps between stones. Each sound made her breathe faster, which meant less time, which made her breathe faster still. The panic spiral every buried Vestal, discovered in her first hour underground. She forced her lungs to slow, counted each breath like she'd once counted prayers. The wheat crown had fallen from her head, stalks scattered across the floor. She picked one up, rolled it between her fingers. The dry stem cracked, loud as thunder in the silence. That's when she heard the scratching, not from above, from the walls, rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails on stone. Her spine went rigid. The lamp flame guttered in a breeze that couldn't exist. Not down here. Not in this sealed tomb. The scratching stopped. Started again. Closer. She knew what it was before her mind would accept it. Other chambers honeycombed this ground. Other Vestals buried over centuries. The earth here was more tomb than soil. And sometimes, in the settling of dirt and stone, walls grew thin. Sounds carried between chambers that should stay separate. Another Vestal was dying next door. The scratching came in patterns now. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, a code, a message, or just the random spasms of fingers already past saving. Licinia pressed her palm against the wall. The stone felt warm, body warm, like something on the other side was pressing back. "Can you hear me?" Her voice cracked on the words. The scratching stopped, then erupted in a frenzy, desperate, frantic. The sound of someone who'd been alone too long suddenly discovering she wasn't. The stone vibrated under Licinia's hand. Dust rained from the ceiling. She had to make it stop. The noise would draw the workers back. They'd hear the commotion through the earth, think she was trying to escape. "Add more stones, more weight, make certain." "Please," she whispered. "You have to be quiet." But the scratching only intensified. Now she heard breathing too. Ragged gasps filtering through stone. The other Vestal was using her last strength, her last air, to make contact, to not die alone. Licinia grabbed the pitcher, poured a handful of water onto the dirt floor, mixed it with her fingers until she had mud, began packing it into the cracks where sound leaked through. Each handful meant less water to drink. Each moment of work meant more air consumed. But the scratching had to stop. It took an hour, maybe more. Time meant nothing in the darkness. When she finished, silence had returned. Perfect. Absolute. She couldn't even hear her neighbors breathing anymore. The lamp flame danced lower. She'd used too much air moving around, working. The oil level had dropped by a finger's width. 5 hours gone already. 19 to go. Then darkness, until the end. She thought about the workers above. Did they have nightmares? Did they wake to the sound of scratching? Some of them had been sealing chambers for decades. Hundreds of women buried by their hands. At taverns, did they drink to forget the sounds that filtered up through earth? The pleading, the prayers, the screams that always came on the second day. One worker had quit last year. She'd heard the Vestals discussing it. He'd claimed the ground was haunted. Said he heard singing from below even weeks after a burial. Said the earth above fresh chambers stayed warm to the touch, like the women below were still breathing. still heating the soil with their final fevered hours. They'd found him hanging from a beam in his workshop. The note said only, "I hear them all." Licinia understood now. The chamber wasn't just a tomb. It was a concert hall of horror. Every sound magnified, every breath counting down to silence, every scratch and whisper joining the chorus of the dead. She crawled to the pallet, lay down fully dressed, the wedding silks already filthy with mud and fear sweat. The lamp cast her shadow on the ceiling. It looked like a woman floating, drowning in earth instead of water. That's when the singing started. Not from next door, from below, faint as wind through cracks, but unmistakably human. Female, young. The melody was a Vestal prayer, one they taught the newest girls. A song about tending flames and keeping faith. But the voice singing it was years past saving. More voices joined, different distances, different stages of decay. Some strong, maybe only days buried. Others whisper thin, clinging to existence by threads. They sang in rounds, the prayer echoing through the honeycomb of chambers, a choir of the condemned praising the goddess who'd thrown them away. Licinia covered her ears, but the sound came through her bones, through the stone, through the earth itself. This was the secret horror. Not dying alone, but dying in company. Surrounded by sisters you couldn't see, couldn't save, could only listen to as they sang themselves into silence. The lamp oil continued its slow descent. 4 hours left, maybe 5. Then she'd join the choir in darkness, add her voice to the eternal round, sing until her throat went dry, until her air ran out, until she became just another sound leaking through stone, driving the next buried woman mad. But the scratching had stopped. Her neighbour had gone quiet, whether from Licinia's mud packing or from crossing that final threshold. She couldn't know, didn't want to know. The singing continued, but that one voice was missing. That one desperate attempt at connection had failed. She found herself hoping the workers would add extra stones, extra weight, make certain no sound escaped to torment the next woman, because now she understood the worst part wasn't the burial. It was knowing you'd become part of the horror for whoever came next. Your voice joining the underground choir, your scratching adding to the symphony of the damned, your last breath warming the earth above, making workers reach for wine to forget what they'd done. The lamp flame flickered, danced, through wild shadows that looked like reaching hands. Those who survived their 30 years discovered that freedom was just another form of burial. The temple doors closed behind her for the last time, and the former Vestal realized she had nowhere on earth to go, 38 years old. That number echoed in Amelia's mind as she stood on the temple steps, no longer permitted inside. The morning sun struck her face without the filter of a sacred veil. For 3 decades she'd worn white. Now the coarse brown wool of a common woman's stola scratched against skin that had known only silk. Behind her, the bronze hinges groaned their final farewell. The sound cut through the forum's morning bustle like a blade. Merchants haggling over prices. Children chasing dogs between market stalls. Normal life flowing around her like water around a stone. Except she wasn't part of it. Couldn't be. Not after what she'd been. The crowd noticed her standing there. How could they not? Yesterday she'd walked these same streets in sacred white, protected by lictors, path cleared by divine authority. Today she looked like any widow, except her eyes. Those gave her away. The particular hollowness of someone who'd spent 30 years staring into sacred flames. Emilia, a woman's voice, hesitant, one of her sisters from before, from the life she'd lived until age 6, when the priests came. Is that really you? Her birth name sounded foreign on her own sister's lips. She'd been Vestalis Secunda for so long, the second Vestal, now just Amelia again, a name that fit like borrowed clothes. Claudia. Her voice came out wrong, too formal, too careful, the voice of someone who'd spoken only ritual words for decades. Her sister shifted uncomfortably. The distance between them might have been an ocean. Claudia had grey in her hair now, lines around her eyes from laughing at children's games. A life lived while Amelia tended flames. Mother's been waiting, hoping. We heard your term ended. Claudia reached out, then pulled her hand back. You could come home. Home. The word meant nothing. Their mother would be 70 now, a stranger who'd lost a daughter and gained back something else, something that looked like her child but moved wrong, spoke wrong, existed wrong. I need to make arrangements first. The lie came easily. What arrangements? She owned nothing. The clothes on her back belonged to the temple, given as final charity. The few coins in her purse, a severance that would last maybe a month. After that, the street, or worse. But the marriage negotiations would begin soon enough. Within a week, the first offer arrived. A widower of 60, looking for someone to manage his household, someone disciplined, obedient, too old to give him children but young enough to outlive him and tend his funeral rites. The marriage broker spoke of it like selling livestock. She's untouched, he assured the prospective husband. The Vestals are examined, verified. You'd be her first. The widower looked her over like examining a horse's teeth, circled her where she stood in the broker's office. She kept her eyes fixed forward, the way she'd learned during temple inspections. Don't flinch. Don't react. Become stone. She's old, the widower concluded, and strange. Look at her eyes. Empty, like she's not really there. The temple does that, the broker admitted, but she's docile, trained to obey, to serve without question. I'll consider it. He didn't return, neither did the next prospect, or the next. Word spread through Rome's marriage market. The former Vestal was cursed, contaminated by too much purity. 30 years of sacred virginity had curdled into something repellent. Men wanted wives, not marble statues that breathed. She tried washing clothes for coin. The other washerwomen whispered when she arrived at the public fountains, moved away from her spot, left a circle of emptiness where she worked. They knew who she was, what she'd been. Some made signs against evil when she passed. Don't let her touch your linens, one hissed to another. That kind of purity rubs off wrong, makes things brittle, cold. By the second month, no one would hire her. Shop owners turned her away. The position's been filled. Innkeepers suddenly had no rooms. We're completely full. Even the temples wouldn't accept her offerings. The goddess prefers gifts from active worshippers. The nights were the worst part. She'd rented a small room in the Subura with her dwindling coins. One window, one door, a pallet on the floor. After 30 years in the house of Vesta, the silence felt wrong. No bells calling her to midnight prayers. No sisters breathing in nearby beds. No eternal flame casting dancing shadows. She'd wake at the ritual hours, body trained by decades to rise, pray, tend. But there was no flame to feed, no prayers to chant, no purpose to fulfill. Just empty hours until dawn, sitting in darkness because oil for lamps cost money she didn't have. That's when the flashbacks started. Not memories exactly, more like possessions, her body reliving moments without her mind's permission. She'd be washing her face and suddenly feel the ritual oils on her skin, the weight of the sacred headdress, the press of sisters' hands during the purification ceremonies. Once, buying bread at market, she heard temple bells. Not real ones. The ones in her head, calling her to duties she no longer had. She'd dropped the bread, started walking toward the temple before catching herself. The baker stared at her like she'd gone mad. Maybe she had. The worst flashback came at night. She dozed on her pallet and woke to phantom flames, the eternal fire burning in her room, demanding tending. She'd scrambled up, reaching for oils that weren't there, fed invisible flames with trembling hands. Only when her fingers found bare floor did reality crash back. She sat in the darkness, shaking, 30 years of muscle memory screaming at her to return to the temple, to feed the flame, to be what she'd always been. But those doors had closed, that life had ended, and this half-existence was all that remained. Her family tried exactly once to reclaim her. The summons came on a morning when hunger had already hollowed her to bone. Her mother wanted to see her. The daughter returned from sacred service, the reunion every Roman family was supposed to celebrate. The house looked smaller than memory suggested, or maybe she'd just forgotten what normal homes looked like after decades in marble halls. Her mother waited in the atrium, surrounded by grandchildren Amelia had never met. Her sister's children, her brother's broods, all staring at the stranger aunt with curious eyes. My daughter. Her mother's voice broke on the words. She'd aged into fragility, this woman who'd once fought the priests when they came. You've come home. But it wasn't home. Nothing was. The children whispered behind their hands. The slaves moved around her like she carried disease. Even the family dog growled when she reached to pet it. Dinner was worse. They'd prepared a feast, her favorite dishes from childhood, except she couldn't remember liking them. 30 years of ritual fasting had changed her palate. Everything tasted wrong. Too rich, too spiced, too much for a stomach trained on bread and water. Tell us about the temple, her youngest brother urged. He'd been 2 when she left, now a man with sons of his own. What was it like? The sacred mysteries? I can't. The words came out flat. Those things aren't spoken. But you're not a Vestal anymore. He leaned forward, eager. Surely now you can share. She stared at him. How to explain that the vows didn't end with service, that the secrets carved into her bones would stay there until they burned on a pyre, that she'd forgotten how to speak of anything but ritual and flame? The evening dissolved into awkward silence. Her mother trying to bridge 30 years with small talk, her siblings exchanging glances that said what words couldn't, the children growing restless, bored by this strange aunt who moved like a ghost. You'll stay, of course, her mother said as the evening died. Your room is ready. We've kept it just as you left it. Amelia climbed the stairs to see. The room sat frozen in time. A child's space, dolls on shelves, a small bed with faded pink coverlets, clothes for a 6-year-old still folded in chests. Her mother had preserved a daughter who no longer existed. I can't stay. But where will you go? Tears ran down her mother's cheeks. Your family. You belong here. Except she didn't, couldn't. The house pressed against her like a tomb. All these people sharing blood but not life, not understanding, looking at her and seeing tragedy instead of person. She left that night, slipped out while the household slept, back to her rented room, back to hunger and isolation and flashbacks, because that loneliness felt more honest than pretending to be someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone at all. By the 4th month, she understood why some chose the river. The Tiber ran brown and swift past the markets. She stood on the bridge, watching debris swirl in eddies. Wood, cloth, things that had outlived purpose. Like her. Other women jumped from this spot, disgraced wives, abandoned mothers, ruined daughters. The river took them all without judgment, washed them to sea where identity dissolved into salt and foam. Her fingers gripped the stone railing. All it would take was leaning forward, letting weight and water do the rest. No more hunger, no more flashbacks, no more existing in the spaces between real life. Just silence, peace, an ending that made sense. Don't. A voice behind her. Young, female, afraid. She turned to find a girl of maybe 16. Pretty in that common way Rome produced by thousands. But her eyes held recognition, understanding. You're the Vestal. Former Vestal. Amelia. I'm no one. My aunt was one too. Served her 30. Came out 5 years ago. The girl moved closer, like approaching a spooked animal. She lasted 6 months. Then the bridge. We found her downstream. The words hit like cold water. Another sister gone to water. How many ended this way, released into a world that had no place for what they'd become? She left a note, the girl continued. Said the nightmares were bad, but the waking flashbacks would destroy what remained of her mind. The nightmares were bad, but the waking flashbacks would destroy what remained of her mind. She checked the candle flame 17 times that night, just as she had every night for 30 years. The wick needed trimming at precisely the length her fingers remembered. Too long, and it would smoke. Too short, and it would drown in melted wax. Her hands moved without thought, performing the ritual that no longer mattered to anyone but her. Outside her window, Rome slept. Inside her rented room, Amelia counted, checked, adjusted. The habits carved into her bones wouldn't release their grip. The candle wasn't sacred, just tallow bought cheap from a street vendor who'd overcharged her, knowing she wouldn't haggle. But her body didn't understand the difference. Muscle memory demanded perfection. If the flame flickered wrong, her breathing quickened. If it smoked, Her hands trembled until she fixed it. By the 18th check, dawn light crept through cracks in the shutters. Time for morning prayers. Except there were no prayers anymore. No sisters to join in harmony. No bronze bells calling her to duty. Just the silence of a city waking while she performed empty rituals for an absent goddess. The panic attack hit as she tried to eat breakfast. One moment she was lifting bread to her mouth. The next, her throat closed like invisible hands were squeezing. The bread fell. Her chest seized. Air wouldn't come no matter how hard she pulled at it. This was divine punishment. The goddess striking her down for abandoning the temple, for letting 30 years of service end, for existing past her purpose. She dropped to her knees, gasping. The sound wheezed through her constricted throat. In the temple, someone would have helped, held her, reminded her to breathe slowly. Here, she fought alone against her own body's betrayal. The attack passed, as they always did, but it left her shaking on the floor, bread scattered around her like an offering rejected. She'd clean it up later. First, she had to check the candle flame, make sure her collapse hadn't disturbed it. 17 times. Always 17. The number of Vestals who died during her service. The Market Whispers started her second year of freedom. She'd gone to buy oil for her endless candle vigils. The merchant's wife leaned close to her customer, voice pitched to carry. That's her, the Vestal who went mad. Counts everything 17 times. Won't eat unless she's checked some invisible flame first. The customer turned to stare. Everyone stared now. The mad former Vestal had become neighborhood entertainment. Children followed her through streets, mimicking her precise walk, counting their steps aloud. 17. Always 17. My husband says she talks to herself at night, another woman added, reciting prayers to nobody. Same words, over and over, like she's trapped in them. Amelia heard it all. Her training had taught her to catch whispers across the temple's echo-prone spaces. These crude gossips had no idea how their words carried. Or maybe they did. Maybe cruelty was the point. She bought her oil in silence, counted out coins with shaking hands. 1, 2, 3. The merchant snatched them before she could reach 17. His face twisted with disgust. Take your business elsewhere next time. You're scaring away real customers. Real customers. Real people. Not whatever she'd become. This neither nor thing. Too pure for normal life. Too broken for sacred purpose. The walk home took 34 steps. Double 17. That felt right. Balanced. She'd started measuring all distances by that number. 17 steps to the fountain. 34 to the bread cellar. 51 to the temple she could no longer enter. Inside her room she lit the new candle with the old one's dying flame. The ritual soothed something deep in her bones. As long as the fire transferred, continuity remained. The sacred flame lived on, even if only in tallow and smoke. But first she had to check it. 17 times. Always 17. The compulsions multiplied like insects breeding in summer heat. Check the flame 17 times. Touch each wall of her room in sequence. North, south, east, west. Repeating until the count reached 17. Arrange her few possessions in perfect lines. The angles mattered. 30 degrees between objects. The sacred geometry that had governed temple arrangements. If she missed a step, death would come. Not her death. Someone else's. Someone innocent. The gods punished broken patterns through random suffering. Every Vestal knew this. Had seen it proven when novices made mistakes and citizens died in accidents the next day. So Emilia maintained her vigilance. Protected Rome through secret rituals in a cramped room. No one understood. No one needed to. The work continued whether witnessed or not. Sleep became impossible. How could she rest when the flame needed checking? When the walls demanded touching? When the count might slip and doom some stranger to death? She dozed in fragments. 17 minutes here, 17 there. Never deep enough to dream. Dreams were dangerous. In dreams she walked temple halls again, heard sister voices calling, woke believing she'd overslept for duties that no longer existed. Better to stay aware, alert, counting. The neighbors complained about the pacing. Her footsteps at all hours, measuring distances. The landlord threatened eviction. Where would she go? The streets. She'd end up counting cobblestones. Touching buildings in sequence. A mad woman performing invisible duties for an ungrateful city. Just stop, her sister pleaded during one of her unwelcome visits. The counting, the checking, none of it matters anymore. But Claudia didn't understand. Couldn't. She'd lived a normal life. Marriage, children, never felt the weight of Rome's survival resting on perfect ritual performance. Never spent 30 years knowing one mistake could doom thousands. The habits weren't madness. They were mercy. The only thing standing between Rome and divine wrath was Amelia's continued vigilance. Let others mock. Let them whisper. She'd bear their contempt to keep them safe. Check the flame. Touch the walls. Count to 17. Always 17. The day she forgot the pattern, her mind cracked like dropped pottery. She'd been arranging her possessions in their sacred geometry when someone knocked. The sound scattered her concentration. Where was she in the count? 12? 13? The number fled like smoke. Panic flooded her throat. Without the count, the pattern broke. Without the pattern, protection failed. Someone would die. Maybe many someones. All because she'd lost track of a number. She tried starting over. 1, 2, 3. But what if she'd already counted those? What if she was duplicating, making it 34 instead of 17? The gods hated imprecision as much as incompletion. The knock came again. Harder. Impatient. Go away. The words tore from her throat. You're ruining everything. Open this door. Her landlord's voice. You're 3 months behind on rent. 3 months. When had time passed? She'd been so focused on maintaining patterns that mundane concerns like money had dissolved. The few coins from the temple had run out without her noticing. I need more time. You need to leave. Today. Or I call the urban cohorts. Leave. Abandon her post. Let the flame die. Let the patterns break. Let Rome suffer for her failure. She opened the door because the alternative was worse. The landlord's face twisted at her appearance. When had she last bathed? Changed clothes. The brown wool hung off her frame, stained with tallow drips and the oils she'd tried to make from memory. You're mad, he said. Not accusation, simple fact. I should have thrown you out months ago. He was right. The madness showed in every part of her. The way her fingers twitched, still counting. How her eyes darted to the candle, checking its flame. The mumbled prayers that leaked from her lips without permission. One more night. Please. I have to maintain the... You have 1 hour. He left. She stood in the doorway, watching him descend stairs she'd counted thousands of times. Without this room, where would she perform the rituals? How would she protect Rome from divine wrath? The answer came with terrible clarity. She wouldn't. Couldn't. The patterns would break. The city would suffer. All because she'd failed to pay rent. She laughed. The sound started low, bubbling up from some deep place. Her first laugh in decades. It tasted like copper and ash, like madness finally admitted. She laughed at the cosmic joke. 30 years of perfect service, never missing a prayer, never letting the flame die, only to fail now, because she'd forgotten money existed. The gods had a sense of humor after all. Black as temple smoke, cruel as August heat. The laughter wouldn't stop. It poured out in waves, each one louder than the last. Tears streamed down her face. Snot bubbled from her nose. Still she laughed. At the ceiling. At the walls she'd touched 17,000 times. At the candle flame that suddenly seemed so small, so pointless, so absolutely absurd. Her body convulsed with it. Ribs aching. Throat raw. The laughter of someone who'd finally understood the punchline to a joke 3 decades in the making. The neighbors came to stare, crowded her doorway, watched the mad Vestal dissolve into hysterics over nothing they could see. Some made signs against evil, others just shook their heads. She's finally snapped, someone whispered. Yes, snapped, broken, shattered into 17 pieces that would never fit together again. The thought sent fresh waves of laughter through her. 17. Always 17. Even in madness, the pattern held. When the urban cohorts arrived, she was still laughing. They had to carry her out, her body limp with exhaustion but still shaking with mirth. The candle flame died as they dragged her past. She watched it gutter out and laughed harder. No divine punishment came, no thunderbolts, no plagues, just silence where flame had been. Rome survived her failure, would continue surviving, had never needed her vigilance at all. The revelation should have freed her. Instead, it completed her destruction. Without purpose, without pattern, without point, what was she? Just a mad woman who'd wasted 30 years on nothing, who'd broken herself for ungrateful gods, who'd counted 17 times until numbers lost all meaning. They deposited her in the street. Her few possessions followed, thrown from the window. The brown wool, the empty oil bottle, the stub of candle, still warm. She sat in the gutter, holding that dead candle, still laughing, still counting, still checking a flame that no longer existed. The patterns had become her prison, but also her identity. Without them she was nothing. The sacred madness, they started calling it. The divine disease that struck former Vestals. Emilia wasn't the first, wouldn't be the last. All over Rome, women emerged from 30 years of service to find their minds couldn't adapt, couldn't stop the rituals, couldn't silence the prayers, couldn't exist without purpose. They wandered the streets performing invisible duties, tending flames that weren't there, counting steps to nowhere, arranging objects in patterns only they understood. The city tolerated them, like it tolerated all broken things, with disgust and distance and the occasional thrown coin. Some found shelter in doorways, others in the ruins beyond the walls. They gathered sometimes, these mad Vestals, recognized each other by the way they moved, the precise gestures, the lips that never stopped forming silent prayers. Together they created new temples from nothing, drew sacred boundaries in dust, maintained flames of imagination that burned brighter than any real fire. Let others call it madness. They knew better, knew that once you'd served the goddess, you never really stopped. The service just changed form. Emilia learned to beg with ritual precision. 17 words repeated to passers-by. Most ignored her. Some spat, but occasionally someone understood, dropped coins that let her buy candles, real ones, to tend through the night while the city slept. She slept in the forum now, close to the temple she couldn't enter. Sometimes she heard the real Vestals singing morning prayers. Her lips moved with the words. Her body swayed to rhythms carved in bone. For those moments, she wasn't mad, wasn't broken, was simply what she'd always been. A keeper of flames, a counter of patterns, a woman who'd given everything to gods who'd taken it all. The madness was mercy. Without it, she'd have to feel the full weight of what she'd lost. Instead, she lived in the eternal now of ritual. Check the flame. Count to 17. Touch the walls that weren't there. Protect Rome from threats that existed only in her fractured mind. Sometimes, young Vestals saw her from the temple portico, recognized what she'd been, what they'd become. Their faces went pale above white robes. They turned away quickly, but not before she saw the fear, the knowledge, the counting that had already begun in their own minds. 17 years of service left. 17 years until they joined her in the streets. 17 years to prepare for a freedom that would destroy them from within. She tried to warn them once. Approached the temple steps on a feast day. The lictors blocked her path, but she called out anyway. The patterns don't end. The counting never stops. Prepare yourselves. They dragged her away, threw her in the Tiber to wash off the mad woman's touch. But she saw one young Vestal's face before they did. Saw understanding bloom there. Saw fingers start to twitch in a counting motion. That one might survive. Might find a way to break free before the patterns set like concrete in her mind. Or might end up worse. Might count to 34, 51. Numbers that held no sacred balance. Numbers that would drive her past madness into whatever waited beyond. Emilia pulled herself from the river. Water couldn't wash away what she'd become. Nothing could. The patterns lived in her bones now. Would outline her corpse when she finally died. 17 ribs. 17 vertebrae. 17 reasons why the gods were cruel. She laughed as she walked back to her doorway, counted each step, checked for flames in every puddle's reflection. The other madwomen would be waiting. They'd share candle stubs, tell stories of when they were whole, perform rituals that meant nothing to anyone but them. This was their temple now. The streets, their sacred ground, the madness, their final vow. Some found a way to survive by becoming the very monsters who had destroyed them. The old woman's hands shook as she taught the 6-year-old girl the same words that had stolen her own childhood. Vesta, Virgin Guardian, Keeper of the Sacred Flame. The prayer came out mechanical, each syllable placed with the precision of someone who'd repeated it 10,000 times. Behind them, the temple's bronze doors caught the afternoon sun, throwing light across the novice quarters where another generation learned to disappear. The child stumbled over the ancient Latin. Her tongue, still soft with baby words, couldn't wrap around the harsh consonants. Any other teacher would show patience, would smile, would encourage. But Claudia Quinta had forgotten how to do anything but recite. Again, her voice carried no emotion. 30 years in the temple, 10 more training the replacements for her sisters. She'd become the machine that produced machines. The little girl's eyes filled with tears she'd already learned not to shed. They all learned that first, before the prayers, before the rituals, before anything else. They learned that crying brought consequences. Vesta, Virgin Guard. The child's voice cracked. Claudia's hand moved without thought. Not to strike. Never to strike. That would leave marks the public might see. Instead, she gripped the girl's shoulder, found the pressure point just below the collarbone. Squeezed with practiced precision, the child's tears dried instantly, shocked back by pain that left no bruise. Perfect recitation or perfect silence? Choose. She hated herself for saying it, hated the way the words came out in the exact cadence her own teacher had used 40 years ago. But what choice did she have? Train them soft and they'd break under the weight of service. Train them hard and they might survive to train others. The circular horror of it made her stomach clench. Around them, 5 other former Vestals worked with their own assigned novices, each woman over 40, each moving with the same mechanical precision, each destroying childhoods with the efficiency of long practice. They never spoke of what they'd become. These women who'd survived their 30 years only to discover freedom meant conscription into a different kind of service. The temple needed trainers who understood, who'd lived through every punishment, who could prepare the next generation for horrors they couldn't name. So they taught, day after day, year after year, watching themselves reflected in shrinking spirits and perfecting postures. The worst part was the gratitude. Thank you, Magistra. The little girl had found her voice again, performed the ritual bow, kept her eyes properly downcast. I'll practice harder. Magistra. Teacher. The title they'd given Claudia when they'd dragged her back to the temple. Not as a Vestal. Never again as that. But as something worse. A survivor forced to create more survivors. She wanted to gather the child close, whisper warnings, tell her to fail the training, to prove herself unworthy before the vows locked around her throat. But 2 other trainers watched from across the room, always watching, making sure no one went soft. No one tried to save these girls from their fate. Practice the genuflection. Claudia's voice stayed flat. 100 repetitions. I'll return to check your form. She left the child kneeling on cold stone, walked the halls she'd once called home. Every corner held ghosts. Here, where Licinia had laughed before her trial. There, where Cornelia had been dragged away in chains. Each memory a weight that pressed her deeper into the automated movements of her day. The other trainers passed her in silence. They'd learned not to speak beyond necessity. Words might crack the careful emptiness they'd cultivated, might let them feel what they were doing. Marcus had tried talking once, 3 years into their shared service as trainers. He'd been the only male survivor brought back, a former priest who'd aged out but knew the rituals. Late one night, he'd found Claudia in the garden. We could refuse. His whisper had barely disturbed the fountain's splash. All of us. Together. What would they do? She'd looked at him with eyes that had watched 2 sisters buried alive. They'd find others, crueler ones ones who enjoyed it. Fact. He'd never spoken of rebellion again. The next morning, he'd made a novice stand in ice water for an hour because she'd yawned during prayers. The transformation complete. That was the trap within the trap. Stay and become complicit. Leave and let someone worse take your place. Someone who'd never felt the rod's kiss. Never counted flames in the darkness. Never learned that mercy could exist even in cruelty's heart. So they stayed. Taught. Broke children as gently as breaking allowed. The recruiting started with lists they were forced to compile. Every summer, Claudia walked through Rome's neighborhoods. Not the poor sections. The temple had learned that lesson. Hungry children died too often during training. Better to choose from families with just enough wealth to feed their daughters, but not enough to bribe their way out of selection. She carried wax tablets, recorded names, ages, addresses, which girls showed the right combination of beauty and strength, which mothers looked away when their daughters played, already practicing letting go. That one. The priest accompanying her pointed to a girl chasing pigeons in a courtyard. 7 years old. Dark hair that would look striking beneath a white veil. Strong legs from running. Clear skin, despite the city's filth. Claudia dutifully recorded the details. House of the merchant Quintus. 3rd daughter. Name, Julia. Age, suitable. Temperament, spirited but trainable. The priest moved on. She lingered, watching the child laugh. In 2 months, the selection horns would sound. This Julia would hear her name called, would be wrapped in white and taken, would have that laugh beaten out of her by patient hands. By Claudia's hands, most likely. They'd assign her the spirited ones. She had a gift for breaking them without quite destroying them, for leaving just enough self intact to maintain the sacred duties. Magistra. The priest had noticed her delay. The next street awaits. She followed, recorded more names, evaluated more children like livestock, all while her mind screamed warnings these girls would never hear. At night, she returned to the quarters they'd assigned the trainers. Not the sacred dormitory. That belonged to real Vestals. They housed the trainers in repurposed storage rooms, close enough to hear the temple bells, far enough to remember they no longer belonged. The other women sat in silence, mending practice veils. Their fingers moved without thought. 30 years of tending sacred garments had carved those motions into muscle. Now they sewed clothes for children who'd wear them until they earned real vestments, or died trying. How many? Octavia asked without looking up. She'd served with Claudia once. Now they served a different master. The same master in a different mask. 17 suitable candidates. The number tasted like ash. The priests want 23. They always want more than the city can provide. Emilia's voice came from the corner. She'd been the gentlest of them as a Vestal. Now she trained novices in the art of staying awake for 3 days straight. They'll take what we give them and complain it's not enough. The needle slipped in Claudia's hand, drew blood from her thumb. She watched the red bead well up. Such a small pain compared to what these chosen girls would endure. Remember when we thought selection was the worst part? The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence greeted her. They didn't speak of before, didn't acknowledge they'd once been children playing in courtyards, once had mothers who'd screamed when the priests came, once believed the temple meant honor instead of horror. But she saw the answer in their faces, the tightening around eyes, the pause in their sewing. They remembered, all of them, every moment from selection to freedom to this worse bondage. Julia, she said the name like a prayer, 3rd daughter of Quintus. She laughs when she runs. Not for long. Octavia's prediction fell flat as stone on stone. The next morning brought new trainees to break. 6 girls stood in the practice hall. Yesterday's selections, still dazed from separation, still wearing the clothes they'd been taken in. The priests would burn those later. But first, Claudia had to evaluate, assign, begin the transformation. You, she pointed to the tallest. Step forward. The girl moved like a sleepwalker. Shock did that, made them pliable for the first few days, easy to mold before reality set in, and the fighting began. Name? Livia. No. Claudia kept her voice neutral. You have no name now. You are Novice One. Repeat it. I am. The girl's voice broke. I am Novice One. Again. Until you believe it. While Livia repeated her erasure, Claudia evaluated the others. One crier, two fighters, one who'd already gone silent inside, and one who watched everything with eyes too knowing for her age. That one would be trouble. The smart ones always were. They saw through the rituals to the control beneath, questioned why the goddess demanded suffering, sometimes even whispered doubts to the others. Claudia would have to take that one herself. Break her carefully. Leave the intelligence intact but redirect it towards survival instead of rebellion. The temple needed clever Vestals, just not too clever. You, she faced the knowing child. What do you see when you look at me? The girl studied her with those two sharp eyes. Someone who used to be like us. Murmurs from the other novices. Even through their shock, they registered the insight. Claudia felt the other trainers tense. This was the moment that defined everything. Show weakness and lose control. Show cruelty and become the monster completely. She chose the middle path, the one that hurt most. Yes. Simple admission. I was selected at 7, served 30 years. Now I train, because I know what's coming. Why don't you warn us? Bold question, from someone who'd learned not to ask. I am warning you. Claudia let that settle. Every moment I train you is a warning. Every skill I teach is armor against what's ahead. You can hate me for it. Most do. But hatred is just another tool for surviving what you've begun. The girl absorbed this, nodded once. The first acceptance of many. They'd all accept eventually. Or die. Or go mad. Or survive to stand where Claudia stood, teaching acceptance to the next generation. The wheel turned eternal, grinding spirits into dust that looked like sacred purpose. But sometimes, in the darkest part of night, she let herself imagine it breaking. All of them, trainers and novices alike, simply walking away, letting the sacred flame die, letting the temple stand empty, letting Rome face whatever consequences the gods demanded without feeding them any more daughters. The fantasy never lasted. By dawn, duty reasserted itself. She rose, dressed, walked to the practice hall, found her assigned novices already kneeling, practicing genuflections under another trainer's watch. Straighter spine on the third one, she corrected automatically. The goddess sees imperfection in silhouette as clearly as in speech. The trainer nodded, made the adjustment. The novice's back straightened to the precise angle tradition demanded. One tiny perfection among thousands required. This was how they built Vestals, detail by detail, correction by correction, each trainer adding their expertise to the construction, none of them able to stop, all of them complicit in the architecture of suffering. Magistra Claudia? The youngest novice raised her hand, still new enough to seek permission. My knees hurt. They're supposed to. Truth delivered gently as possible. Pain teaches faster than words. Your body will remember the correct position long after your mind forgets why it matters. She hated how easily the words came, hated how much sense they made, hated that they were true. Her own knees remembered every hour kneeling on stone. That memory had saved her during the endless rituals, the body's wisdom outlasting the mind's rebellion. How long until it stops hurting? Never, Claudia thought. It never stops. You just learn to carry it. When you perfect the form, she said instead, practice creates strength. Strength enables endurance. Endurance becomes immunity. Lies wrapped in enough truth to swallow. The same lies she'd been fed. The same lies these girls would feed others if they survived to wear her title. The morning bell rang. Time for the next lesson. She guided them to the flame chamber. Not the real one. Never that. This practice space held only a bronze bowl with oil-soaked rags. But it would teach them the basics. How to feed without smothering. How to maintain without obsessing. How to make their entire existence revolve around keeping something alive that cared nothing for their lives. Watch. She demonstrated the proper wrist motion for adding oil. Too much, and you drown the flame. Too little, and it starves. The goddess demands perfect balance. 6 pairs of eyes tracked her movements. 6 minds already beginning the calculations that would consume 30 years. If they lasted. if they proved worthy. If they survived what Claudia survived to stand here, teaching survival to children, already dead in every way that mattered. The oil flask trembled in her hand. Just once. Just enough for the sharp-eyed girl to notice. Their eyes met across the practice flame. Understanding passed between them. The girl saw what Claudia had become, what they'd all become, trapped in amber of their own making, teaching horror because the alternative was letting it run wild. "Your turn," Claudia said, handed over the flask, watched small hands try to steady its weight. The girl poured, too much at first. The flame sputtered, almost died. Then she adjusted, found the balance, fed the fire just enough to keep it dancing. Good. The praise tasted like poison. You're learning to tend, to serve, to pour yourself out drop by drop until nothing remained but the pouring. Claudia watched and hated herself for the pride she felt. The girl would make a good Vestal, would survive where others broke, would stand here someday, teaching other girls to survive. The cycle had no beginning, no end, just this eternal moment of passing trauma between generations, each woman thinking she made it easier for the next, each woman lying to herself about what easier meant. But what else could they do? The machine of Rome's religion demanded fuel. If not these girls, then others. If not trained by survivors, then by those who'd never felt the weight. At least Claudia could teach them to scream silently, to hide tears, to find the small rebellions that kept selfhood alive, things she'd learned in darkness, things no priest understood. Magistra, another novice. What happens if we fail? Every trainer in the room stopped moving. The question they all dreaded, the one that required lies too large to speak smooth. Define failure, Claudia said carefully. If we can't learn, can't serve, can't be what they want. The truth was written in 3 graves Claudia had helped dig. Young bones in unhallowed ground, girls who'd broken before their training ended. But those weren't stories for children still hoping. Everyone can learn. Half-truth. The goddess chose you. Trust that choice. The girl nodded, accepted, returned to her practice. But Claudia saw the doubt planted. Good. Doubt might save her when faith failed, might teach her to hide weakness until she grew strong enough to bear it. The sharp-eyed girl watched it all, saw the lies, the deflection, the careful dance around truth too heavy for novice shoulders. Her 2 knowing eyes promised she'd remember, would decode what wasn't said, would understand why trainers spoke in riddles. That one would survive. Claudia knew it like she knew the flame's hunger, knew it like she knew her own complicity. The girl had the right combination of intelligence and adaptability, would learn to bend without breaking, would master every ritual while keeping some kernel of self hidden deep, would hate Claudia for teaching her how. The hatred was part of it. Necessary. If the novices loved their trainers, they'd break when tenderness vanished. Better they learn early that no one here meant kindness. That survival meant trusting only yourself. That even those who'd walked your path would push you forward into darkness. Tomorrow we begin the fasting lessons. Claudia announced it like any other practical matter. 3 days without food, water only at sunset. You'll learn how hunger sharpens focus, how empty stomachs make pure vessels. She saw fear ripple through them. Good. Fear would carry them through when determination failed. Fear of punishment, fear of failure, fear of becoming what she'd become. The sharp-eyed girl raised her hand. What if we're already pure? Dangerous question. The kind that got novices marked for special attention, for harder lessons, for breaking that went beyond the body into the soul itself. Purity isn't a state. Claudia chose her words like weapons. It's a practice. Daily, hourly, breath by breath. You're never pure enough, never perfect enough. The striving itself becomes the offering. Truth that cut both ways. The girl would hear the warning underneath, would understand that perfection was a moving target, would learn to meet expectations while knowing they'd always rise higher. Or she'd fight it, challenge it, end up beneath the rods learning that questions had consequences. Either way, she'd learn. They all learned. Through compliance or resistance, the lessons carved themselves into flesh. Claudia dismissed them to their quarters. Watched them file out in already straighter lines. Tomorrow they'd move with more precision. Next week, more grace. Month by month, the transformation would progress until girls became ghosts of themselves. She stayed behind in the empty practice chamber, stared at the flame they'd tended. Such a small thing to build a life around. Such a hungry god to feed with childhood. It never gets easier. Octavia's voice from the doorway. I thought it would. Thought eventually we'd feel nothing. But each new group is us, Claudia finished. Over and over, watching ourselves disappear. They stood together in silence. Two women who'd survived everything except escape. Who'd traded white robes for trainers' browns but never left the temple's shadow. Who broke children because broken children survived what whole ones couldn't. The sharp one reminds me of you. Octavia's observation carried weight. Same questions, same defiance hidden under compliance. I know. You'll have to break her harder. The clever ones need harsher lessons. I know. It's kindness, really. Better to learn limits early than test them when the stakes rise. I know. But knowing didn't make it easier. Nothing made it easier. Each group of girls arrived fresh and left hollowed. Each trainer added another year to their sentence. Each perfectly executed ritual bound them tighter to the thing they'd escaped. Sometimes I dream about the fire going out. Octavia's confession fell soft between them. All the flames, every temple, just darkness and silence and freedom. Claudia said nothing. They all had that dream. All woke gasping, checking flames that no longer belonged to them. The conditioning ran too deep. 30 years of muscle memory couldn't be wished away. Then I remember, Octavia continued. Without the temples, where would we go? What would we be? At least here, we have purpose. Purpose. The word tasted like ash. Their purpose was creating more versions of themselves, ensuring the cycle continued, building the machine that had crushed them, piece by precious piece. But Octavia was right. Where else would they fit? The world had no place for women trained to be sacred objects. They'd learned that during their brief freedom. The streets were crueler than the temple. At least here, their suffering served something. Even if that something was just creating more suffering. Even if the wheel they pushed went nowhere. Even if every girl they trained was another ghost haunting their conscience. The flame sputtered. Low on oil. Claudia moved without thinking. Added just enough to keep it alive. Her hands steady despite everything. Despite knowing she'd teach those same motions tomorrow. Despite understanding each lesson was another bar in the cage she helped build. For over 1,000 years this machine of suffering perfected itself. Generation after generation of trainers passing down their wounds. Each thinking they made it better. Each adding refinements to the breaking. The rods grew more precise. The fasting more scientific. The isolation more complete. Claudia was just the latest in an unbroken chain. Would train girls who'd train others who'd train more. On and on until Rome fell, or the gods grew bored, or the last flame finally died. She left the practice chamber, walked halls that echoed with centuries of footsteps, past doorways where countless women had learned to disappear. The temple was a living thing, fed on daughters, breathing out smoke and suffering. Tomorrow she'd wake, train, break spirits with professional precision, teach the sharp-eyed girl that questions led nowhere good, watch understanding dawn in those two knowing eyes, add another ghost to her collection. The day after, she'd do it again, and again, until her hands grew too gnarled to demonstrate proper form, until her voice grew too weak to correct imperfect prayers, until they replaced her with one of the girls she'd trained, and the cycle completed itself once more. This was her punishment for surviving. Not death, not madness, but this endless complicity, this careful construction of future suffering, this knowledge that every skill she taught was another stone in the tomb she'd escaped. The sharp-eyed girl would understand eventually, would hate her for it, would use that hatred to survive, would emerge after 30 years, if she lasted, to find Claudia's role waiting. The trainers always needed replacing. Always needed women who understood the weight of what they taught. And we're about to return to its most horrific moment. The machine ground on, perfect in its cruelty, feeding on the very women who'd learned to feed it. each trainer a gear turning precisely, each novice lubricant for the mechanism, each perfectly maintained flame a beacon calling more daughters to their doom. Claudia reached her quarters, lay on her narrow bed, stared at the ceiling she'd memorized over years of sleepless nights. Tomorrow would bring new horrors to teach, new spirits to break professionally. But tonight, in the darkness that felt like home, she let herself remember laughing while chasing pigeons, let herself feel the weight of every girl she'd trained, let herself count the ghosts she'd created in service to gods who demanded only more ghosts. The temple bells rang, calling the Vestals to midnight prayers, calling her to dreams of flames that never died, and girls who never escaped, and trainers who never stopped teaching the architecture of their own destruction. Somewhere across the sleeping city, a 7-year-old girl named Julia dreamed of chasing birds, unaware that her name already filled wax tablets, that her laughter had been measured and found suitable, that women who'd forgotten how to laugh would soon teach her to forget as well. The machine waited, patient as stone, hungry as fire, and Claudia, trapped in its heart, polished its gears with practiced hands. When archaeologists opened the ancient chambers, they found scratch marks on every stone, 1,000 years of fingernails telling the same story. The team from the University of Rome descended into the darkness with headlamps and breathing masks. Their boots crunched on debris that had once been human. The lead archaeologist, Maria Benedetti, swept her light across the wall. Parallel grooves ran from floor to ceiling. 4 lines, then a gap. 4 lines, then a gap. The pattern of desperate fingers seeking escape. Christo, her assistant whispered. The word echoed off stone that had swallowed 10 centuries of final words. They'd found 17 chambers so far beneath the campus Sceleratus, each one identical, 8 feet by 8 feet, 7 feet high, each one containing the same evidence, scratches on every surface, pottery shards from water pitchers thrown in rage, oil lamp fragments ground into powder by pacing feet, and bones, always bones, curled in corners like question marks asking why. But the scratches told the real story, some neat and methodical, counting days in sets of 7, others wild, frantic, carved by fingernails breaking against stone. The worst were the ones that started organized and descended into chaos. You could read the exact moment hope died in the way the lines went from straight to jagged to nothing. Maria documented each mark with academic precision, but her hands shook as she photographed a section near the floor. These scratches formed letters, mater, mother, carved over and over until the stone wore smooth. The numbers alone could stop your heart. Conservative estimates suggested 300 Vestals buried alive over Rome's 1,000-year history, 300 women walking down stone steps into darkness, 300 chambers sealed with ritualistic care, 300 sets of scratch marks joining the geological record of human cruelty. But those were just the official burials, the ones recorded in temple documents. How many others vanished into unofficial holes? How many died in the underground chambers before their 30 years ended? How many simply disappeared when they became inconvenient? Look at this. Another archaeologist called from a deeper chamber. The stone here is different. Maria crawled through the narrow passage. Her headlamp caught polished granite instead of rough limestone. This chamber was older, much older, pre-Republic, maybe even from the Kingdom period. The scratches here had fossilized into the stone itself. Generations of rain and minerals had filled the grooves with calcite, preserving them like prehistoric fossils. She ran her fingers over marks made 700 years before Christ. Some desperate woman had clawed at these walls while Romulus's grandchildren walked above. The tradition was already ancient when Caesar was born, already perfected when Augustus reformed the empire, already 1,000 years old when Rome finally fell. "How many chambers do you think we'll find?" her assistant asked. Maria didn't answer. Couldn't, because she'd already done the math. If 300 official burials happened over a millennium, and each Vestal served 30 years, and 6 served at any time, the numbers suggested thousands of women had worn the white robes, thousands had tended the flame, thousands had lived under the constant threat of these chambers. The threat itself was the torture. Every Vestal who served her full term had still spent 30 years knowing these rooms waited beneath her feet. 30 years of perfect behavior driven by the knowledge that one mistake meant scratching at stone until her fingers bled. They documented 16 more chambers that day, each with its own symphony of scratches, each with its own pottery shards and bone fragments and final messages carved in stone. The archaeological record read like sheet music for a requiem, the same notes repeated across centuries: desperation, rage, bargaining, acceptance, silence. But then they found the chamber that changed everything. This one sat deeper than the others. The passage leading down had partially collapsed, requiring careful excavation. When they finally broke through, their lights illuminated something impossible. The walls were smooth, completely unmarked. Not a single scratch disturbed the stone surface. Maybe it was never used, the assistant suggested, but the bones in the corner said otherwise. A complete skeleton, undisturbed, arranged in perfect repose, hands folded, legs straight, as if she'd simply laid down and waited. The pottery remained unbroken. The oil lamp sat upright, its wick still visible after centuries. Maria approached the skeleton with reverence. This woman hadn't fought, hadn't scraped, hadn't spent her final days adding to the chorus of scratch marks. She'd simply accepted, or been drugged, or been dead before they sealed her in. The possibilities made Maria's skin crawl. But near the skeleton's hand, pressed into the dirt floor, they found something else. A bronze hairpin, the kind Vestals wore. But this one had been modified, sharpened to a point, worn smooth by handling. A weapon disguised as jewelry. The truth hit Maria like cold water. This woman had another option, had carried it through her entire service, had kept it hidden, waiting. When they finally came for her, she didn't go into the darkness to scratch and scream and suffer. She went down with dignity and chose her own ending. The suicide pin changed their understanding of everything. How many other Vestals had carried similar insurance? How many chose the quick darkness of their own making over the slow suffocation the state prescribed? How many scratch marks were performances, hiding the fact that some women had already escaped? They kept finding chambers. Each expedition revealed more. The honeycomb of tombs spread beneath the campus celeratus like cancer cells. Some chambers connected through collapsed walls, where dying women had heard each other's screams. Others sat in perfect isolation, their occupants dying believing they were alone. The worst discovery came in Chamber 43. Multiple skeletons, 5 women in one room. The scratches here weren't random. They formed words, names, messages. These women had been buried together. Some kind of mass punishment. They'd spent their final days carving their stories into stone, creating a record that would outlast the empire that killed them. Cornelia, innocent of all charges. Licinia, who kept the flame for 20 years. They killed us for knowing too much. The senator's wife lied. We die pure. Maria photographed every word, every accusation, every declaration of innocence. These weren't the desperate scratches of mad women. These were testimonies, evidence, the last words of women who knew history would forget them unless they carved it into stone. The pattern became clear as they mapped the chambers. Clusters of burials corresponded with political upheavals. Whenever Rome faced crisis, Vestals died. Scapegoats for military defeats. Sacrifices for plagues. Convenient victims when powerful men needed to demonstrate piety. The numbers told the story the histories wouldn't. During the Punic Wars, 17 chambers filled in 5 years. After the Social War, 23. The reign of Domitian alone produced 36 burials. Each political crisis demanded virgin blood. Each failure of empire required someone to blame. And through it all, the machine ground on, new girls selected as the old ones died. The chambers filling even as workers dug new ones, the scratches accumulating like sediment, layer upon layer, a geological record of institutionalized femicide. "We should stop," Maria's assistant said one day. They'd catalogued over 100 chambers. "This is too much, too horrible." But Maria couldn't stop. Each chamber was a woman whose name had been erased, each set of scratches a story that demanded telling. She owed them this much, to count them, to record them, to prove they'd existed beyond their utility to roam. The final count would never be complete. Many chambers remained buried too deep to reach. Others had collapsed, their contents mixed with common earth. Some areas were built over, modern Rome sitting atop ancient horrors, but the partial count alone staggered. 287 chambers found, 287 sets of scratch marks documented, 287 women who walked down into darkness, because Rome demanded virgin blood for its hungry gods. And those were just the ones they could find, the ones whose scratches survived, the ones whose bones remained articulated enough to count. The true number hid in the earth, unknowable, a dark matter of suffering that held up the bright lie of Roman civilization. Maria published her findings in academic journals. The public reaction was muted. Ancient cruelty felt safe, historical. Something from a barbaric past humanity had evolved beyond. Few made the connection to modern systems that still demanded purity, still punished women for existing, still buried them in different kinds of chambers. But sometimes, late at night in her apartment, Maria heard scratching, just the pipes settling, just the building breathing, just her imagination translating too much darkness into sound. She'd lie awake counting, 287 confirmed, maybe 500 total, maybe more, each one walking downstairs, each one hearing the stones slide into place, each one spending final days adding their scratches to the accumulated record. The worst part was knowing it had all been meaningless. The flame they protected, just fire. The virginity they preserved, just control. The gods they served, just names for power. 287 women buried alive for nothing. For tradition. For theatre. For the comfort of men who needed someone pure to blame when things went wrong. Maria kept a photo on her desk from Chamber 43. The clearest inscription, letters carved deep by desperate hands. We die pure. Not a boast, not defiance. Just a statement of fact. They'd followed every rule, kept every vow, done everything demanded, and still they died in darkness, scratching truth into stone. The excavations continued. Each season brought new chambers to light, new scratches to document, new accusations carved by dying hands. The archaeological record grew like the chambers themselves. Layer upon layer, horror upon horror, truth upon truth that no one wanted to hear. Because admitting the scope meant admitting the system had been designed this way. The chambers weren't aberrations, they were features. The scratches weren't madness, they were messages. The women weren't victims of excess, they were victims of precision. 1,000 years of refined cruelty, producing exactly the amount of suffering intended. And now we return to that stone stairway, where one young woman is about to become another scratch mark in the darkness. Her foot touched the first step inside the chamber, and the stone felt warm against her bare soul. Body heat from centuries of women who'd taken this same journey. The warmth would fade soon. Everything faded down here. Behind her, the last sliver of daylight narrowed as workers slid another stone into place. The grinding sound echoed off the walls, each scrape counting down to silence. She forced herself to descend. 1 step. 2. The wedding dress tangled around her ankles, but she didn't stumble. Couldn't stumble. Even now, dignity mattered. The oil lamp waited on its shelf, flame dancing in the dead air. She lifted it with steady hands. 30 years of tending sacred fire had taught her this much, how to hold light without trembling. The chamber revealed itself in flickering shadows. 8 feet by 8 feet, 7 feet high. She'd heard the measurements whispered in the dormitory. Now she stood inside the arithmetic of her death. The workers above continued their task. Stone against stone, trowels spreading mortar. She could picture their faces, blank with routine. Just another job on a summer afternoon. Another Vestal to seal away. Another set of screams they'd never hear. She set the lamp on the small table beside 3 loaves of bread. 1 pitcher of water. The calculations began automatically. 3 loaves meant 7 days if she rationed. The water would last 4. But the air? She drew a breath, tasted earth and endings. 448 cubic feet of space. maybe 30 hours before suffocation. The mathematics of dying had been perfected over centuries. The final stone slid into place with devastating finality. The grinding stopped. The voices above faded. Then, nothing. Silence so complete, she heard her own heartbeat thundering. The lamp flame bent toward her with each exhale, the only proof she still breathed. That's when the scratching started. Not from above, from the walls. Rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails on stone. Her spine went rigid. Other chambers honeycombed this cursed ground. Other vestals buried over centuries. Sometimes, in the settling of earth and stone, walls grew thin. Sounds carried between tombs that should stay separate. Another woman was dying next door. Had been dying. Would continue dying. Time meant nothing in the dark. The scratching came in patterns now. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. A code, a message, or just the random spasms of fingers already past saving. She pressed her palm against the wall. The stone felt warm, body warm, like something on the other side was pressing back. The scratching intensified, desperate, frantic. The sound of someone who'd been alone too long suddenly discovering she wasn't. Dust rained from her ceiling as the neighboring woman clawed with renewed frenzy. Then singing began. Not from next door, from below. Faint as wind through cracks, but unmistakably human. Female. Young. A Vestal prayer she'd sung 10,000 times. But this voice was years past saving, threading up through layers of earth and bone. More voices joined. Different distances. Different stages of decay. Some strong, maybe only days buried. Others whisper thin, clinging to existence by threads. They sang in rounds, the prayer echoing through the honeycomb of chambers. A choir of the condemned praising the goddess who'd thrown them away. She covered her ears, but the sound came through her bones, through the stone, through the earth itself. This was the secret horror. Not dying alone, but dying in company. Surrounded by sisters you couldn't see, couldn't save, could only listen to, as they sang themselves into silence. The lamp oil had already dropped by a finger's width. 5 hours gone from moving, breathing, being terrified. 19 hours of light remained, then darkness until the end, unless she chose differently. Her hand found the bronze hairpin hidden in her wedding crown, sharpened to a point over months of secret filing, her insurance against the slow suffocation the state prescribed. One quick thrust, and she could join the singers immediately. Or she could wait, add her voice to their eternal round, scratch her own story into stone for archaeologists to find centuries later. The singing swelled. 100 voices. 1,000. Every woman ever buried in this honeycomb of horror, all of them welcoming her to the choir. She pulled out the hairpin, tested its point against her thumb. A bead of blood welled up, black in the lamplight. So easy, so much quicker than what waited. But first, she had something to carve. The stone resisted at first, then gave way as she found the rhythm, letter by letter, word by word. Her truth scratched into the wall that would outlast the empire that killed her. Let them find it someday. Let them know. Above, the city of Rome continued its business. Merchants hawked wares, children played, the Senate debated. Life flowed on, built atop chambers full of scratches, built on the bones of women who'd kept their flames burning until the darkness claimed them. She carved deeper. The singing grew louder. The lamp flame danced lower. And in 1,000 years, someone would run their fingers over these marks and wonder. But they'd never truly understand. How could they? How could anyone who hadn't walked down those stairs, heard those stones slide shut, felt the air grow thin? How could they comprehend what Rome had done? The bronze hairpin slipped from trembling fingers. Clattered on stone, she'd wait, choose the slow path, add her scratches to the accumulated record, because someone should document this. Someone should ensure the horror wasn't forgotten. She picked up the pin again, returned to her carving. Around her, the eternal choir sang on, patient as stone, hungry as flame, waiting for her voice to join them in the darkness. The lamp flickered, just once. But once was enough to show her the truth. She wasn't alone. never had been, never would be. The darkness held all of them, every Vestal who'd walked these stairs, every woman who'd fed the sacred flame only to be fed to the earth. They waited in the walls, in the scratches, in the songs that would outlast Rome itself. Her carving continued, letter by letter, truth by truth, until her fingers bled, until the stone ran red, until the lamp oil ran low and the darkness pressed closer, and the only sound was scratching hers and theirs and all of theirs together. This machine of suffering had perfected itself over 1,000 years, generation after generation feeding daughters to the darkness, each thinking they served something sacred, each discovering too late that sanctity was just another word for sacrifice. The lamp guttered, the singing swelled, her bloody fingers found the rhythm of all the women before her, scratching, always scratching, adding her voice to the stone that would speak long after Rome fell. Because in the darkness beneath Rome, their fingernails still tell the story scratched into stone, 1,000 years of screaming without sound.